Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Elena Muñoz-Rodriguez. I'm Assistant Curator, Latinx and Latin American Art. So thank you for joining us this evening. And if you want to introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Bony Ramirez. I am a Dominican-born artist, and I have the current show here at Cattleya at the Newark Museum, curated by Elena.
No, that's okay. And so just to give you guys a quick breakdown of the structure of tonight's program, we're going to do the first half down here, so about 40, 45 minutes in conversation. And then we'll do the second half up in the exhibition so you can, experience the exhibition for yourself. And I would ask that you please hold any questions that you might have for Bonnie or myself, probably primarily Bonnie, for when we're up in the galleries. So with that, we can get started. So I just want to give everybody kind of a quick overview of what our global contemporary program is here at the Newark Museum of Art. So we engage in artists for kind of like a residency, but a residency without the artist living here. And it's about a year and a half that they get to kind of work behind the scenes with a curator. They get full access to the collections and storage, and get to kind of do some deep research and create a new body of work in response to our collection, and in conversation with our collection. And so I first became aware of Bonnie and his work probably in 2022, spring of 2022. And I think what I was most drawn to was the way that you play with the human figure, and how you play with portraiture conventions and art historical conventions, and you kind of subvert these recognizable elements, and you incorporate these really kind of distinctly Caribbean elements. And to give everybody an example, this is an artwork that is currently, the artwork, that you see in the center of the screen is an artwork that we commissioned for our 18th and 19th century Seeing America galleries. It's in our Portraits of Power gallery, and I think it really fits nicely with the portraits that are currently in that space that are historical, but also really kind of challenges the viewer in a different way. And I really loved that about your work, and I thought that you would be a perfect candidate for for the Global Contemporary series, because I felt like that our American portraiture collection was really kind of ripe for that level of engagement or critique. And so with that being said, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your process, and about your figures.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody, for taking your time to be here today. Thank you, Elena, also for doing this and for the opportunity, and for also believing in the work as well. This particular portrait was done specifically for the gallery. Playing a lot with the portraiture. A lot of my works are definitely like portraits. In this particular gallery, wanted to play also the space and the composition and how the figure would feel in the space. As most of you kind of already know, the Newark Museum was the first museum I ever visited when I got to when I came to the U.S. So walking through the galleries and seeing the collection and going through the global contemporary process was also really special, almost like a full circle moment that I would never think it was gonna happen. It was never in my mind. Coming to Newark, coming to the museum, growing up, and then now seeing myself in the same space, I think is definitely a really special moment. And especially again with this portraiture as well, with this particular portrait in this gallery.
And so I know, talking about your first visits here to the museum as a teenager, I know that when we first started working together, you mentioned that this Martin Johnson Heade painting that's currently in our landscape galleries was kind of a touch point for you, and almost each time you came to the museum, you kind of made a pilgrimage to that to that painting, which is Cattleya orchid with 2 hummingbirds. And I'm sure most of you know, hopefully, I don't know, let me not assume, that we've taken the name for the exhibition from this painting. So can you talk a little bit more, like what is your relationship to this painting, and how does it connect to this body of work?
Yeah, so I think coming to a museum for the first time in my case, again, was the Newark Museum. And I think I was just looking, other than appreciating the art, I was also looking to see myself in the gallery in some kind of way, shape, or form. And I think this particular painting was something that reminded me of my country. We have, of course, the Caribbean, like very tropical, like orchids is kind of like the spaces where they thrive in. So I just gravitated towards that, not knowing, not thinking about like, how much of a historical piece it is, not knowing anything about the artist at that point. It was just something that felt like home. So I felt like as a full circle moment, having my first museum show in this museum, it was really special to kind of pay homage to that experience and pay homage also to my younger self by like kind of like bringing that back to. And I think it was also a good part of the process to also learn more about this particular work and really go deeper into, the artist and like the composition beyond just like the surface of what you see. But again, just like what brought me to this work was essentially that it felt like home to me.
That's really beautiful. Sorry, I know I've heard that story like 5 times, but it's always like a very touching moment. And I think, as curators, we hope that like people have those moments of connection in the galleries. So to hear that, I think is really great feedback, so thank you. And so I know that this particular orchid, it kind of makes its way into a couple of your artworks that are currently in the exhibition. So can you talk a little bit more about that and kind of how, I guess, some of how this is kind of a thematic emblem for the exhibition?
Yeah, so I think just like going off from this first painting, I've always been really interested in science, other than art. It's always like science always been like on the side as well. So I think just like I kind of just started to dissect the orchid painting in different ways. And one of the things that, gravitated me to that painting again was the orchid. And I thought about or started to think about what orchids are. Like, yes, these are these like very beautiful plants that, in a lot of places and spaces we kind of use it to beautify a space or to just like, they grow and they're beautiful. But I kind of came to a realization that orchids are kind of like just like beautiful parasites. Essentially, orchids just attach themselves to trees. They don't, in their molecular level, they don't bring any benefit to the tree that they attach themselves. They just grow, essentially. It's not a reciprocal benefit for both trees. It's just occupying space. And I feel like we give it a pass as humans because they are, quote unquote, beautiful plants, as if the tree itself was not enough. So I started to think about the Caribbean and in terms of like the outside world that a lot of times the Caribbean has, like that is seen a lot of times as just like a place of leisure. That when you can Google any country in the Caribbean, and the first thing that will come usually as the resorts and the beaches. So I started to think about like how people from outside that are not from the different islands occupy space in other people's spaces, and if when they do, they think about the space that they're occupying. So that's kind of like throughout the different works, you're going to see different themes of that almost, I don't want to say invasive, but this beautiful parasite.
And I think something that's really interesting, so I don't know how many people here have spent time in Florida, but like my parents live in Florida, and you will see people taping them to trees, really kind of forcing their propagation in an area that is not natural to them. And I'm like, I also feel like that's such a
that's actually where it first came to my attention.
Yeah.
Because as I was planning the show, I did like this like trip to Miami, and I saw that in a lot of places there's just people just tape it, which is very common in my country, but in Florida it almost felt like really forced to kind of like beautify the space or whatever. So that's kind of where it clicked a little bit of like how bad do we want them to be part of the ecosystem. Nothing against orchids, of course, they are beautiful plants.
And I think that there's also that U.S. Desire to really kind of like force something, like, and really create something that already isn't there, and to really kind of take control over something that maybe isn't natural, or I don't think I'm explaining myself well. I know, so I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna move on, but that's kind of an incomplete thought, but so going back to the American Portraiture collection, so the painting that you all see on your left is currently in Seeing America on the first floor, 18th and 19th century. And it's an incredibly beautiful and incredibly important John Singleton Copley painting. And I love how your painting, Bonnie, has really kind of subverted this really classic portrait pose that Mrs. Joseph Scott is, engaged in, that she's delicately presenting a little nosegay of flowers and, demurely, fixing her wrap. And your figure is really aggressively presenting a decapitated bird. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about kind of the ways that you engage with and subvert these really classic portrait poses.
Yeah, so I think as a self-taught artist, I think one of my main inspirations was just a lot of going to these older museums or looking at 18th and 19th century portraiture for the most part. So I looked into a lot of these portraits and poses of power, and a lot of these people that were quote unquote important at the time, that were kind of immortalized by these portraits at the time. And then looking at the collection, this painting is already on view at the here at the museum, and I was able to have access to it via the residency. And I knew I wanted to, as a figurative artist in general, to create almost this portraits with the same kind of feel to them, but to emphasize that power a little bit more. And I think that's where this when you look closer at the two hands of my painting on the side, there's this bird that's almost ripped apart. We'll go deeper into the meaning of that later on.
You'll all be able to take a close look in the gallery.
But I think throughout a lot of these works, as you'll see the show, I think the emphasis of power is something that I really make really evident in some works, as well as the opposite. And I think we can get deeper into that as well as we get to the show. But I think it's always important to emphasize that a little bit more.
And one of the other things that I really love that you do is that you really include children in your work. And so these are two artworks that are currently in storage. They were not on view, but that was part of our process, was really kind of spending a lot of time deep in storage, deep in the collections, and you were really drawn to these two children's portraits that are kind of unconventional. And, I think especially the little boy on the right is, I don't want to say that it's silly, but it's definitely he's in a stream in a velvet coat. That's not, and I'm like, oh, if my son did that, I would be pretty annoyed. But it's just these interesting ways of depicting children, and that children kind of deserve this level of careful depiction. And so I'm going to move on to a quick detail. Can you talk a little bit more about why children often feature in your work?
Definitely. I think in this particular case, there's a lot of, I don't want to say metaphors, but there's a lot of things that represent other things in the composition of the works. I think in a lot of times in my work, when I do, especially the kids, they tend to symbolize that that innocence or the start of something. Mm-hmm. So I think in this particular painting is called The Epiphytes. Again, in the scientific terms, epiphytes is kind of the category of the scientific category where orchids fall into being a plant that attaches themselves to another plant and doesn't necessarily bring any benefits to that. And again, going back to like the original idea of the show, I kind of want to have these almost like three little girls, almost like representing that particular, this like magical way of like showing how something can become something else, if that makes sense. So you have like the two ones that are turning the other one into one of them, the two that have like the more plant-like arms.
Yeah, like the foliage
Um,
limbs.
Yeah, and they're almost like these, like it looks like confetti, but they're almost like spores going through the wind, almost like as a form either of like, again, thinking about the start of something, almost like a baptism or like a ceremony of starting something into something else. I think even thinking about like the evolution of the Caribbean throughout the years and how that has changed a lot is something that really comes to the attention of this particular work.
And I think these two portraits from the Newark Museum of Art's collection, you know, compared with the three little girls in the epiphytes, to me is so interesting because they do still have that kind of like innocent cherubic faces, but there's definitely a level of unease and apprehension in your children.
I think there's a lot of like uncertainty in the faces of the figures themselves. I think it's, you know, the start of something new always makes you nervous. So I think that's almost like the feel that it has of like not knowing where things are gonna go. So I think that's kind of like how like the one figure on the bottom, it's almost like sure of what she's doing, and the one who's actually being turned into them, it's kind of like worried about like what exactly does this mean. And I think with evolution and with change, I think that's what comes into play.
And before we move on from these, can you talk, I know that figures in your work that, you know, often sprout, you know, foliage for arms or limbs. Can you talk a little bit more about where that comes from?
Definitely. So I think my work is definitely in the conversation of like more magical realism, almost like surrealism in a way as well. But they're like two periods, but we don't have to get into the technical stuff. But I think, you know, with my work, I tried like different ways to, or like, you know, the basis of magical realism a lot of times is to like interpret reality into different ways. That's why a lot of these like more deeper stories that are being told throughout the paintings are not as literal as you would see with like a more of a traditional portrait artist. So they are definitely like abstracted in a different way, and that's kind of like where the magical realism in the paintings come into play. This like distortions, like the way that the figures are painted, the way that they turn into something else. And I think that's almost like, with my work, I like to make the viewer think. I don't like to present you with literally what the story is trying to say, what the work is trying to say. I am definitely the kind of artist that my work is not up to interpretation. Like, I will tell you what the painting is about. Like, all the works have a specific meaning. Every artist is different, but to me, you know, everything has a meaning, everything has a sense. I don't like, or I let the viewer, I mean, of course, like, you can interpret the word your way, but I will tell you what exactly the work is.
I'll tell you you're wrong.
Just because it's important, specifically with like magical realism and these like bigger stories and events, that the viewer really understands what they're looking at. And if they don't, it also makes them think about and explore and think of all inside of themselves, trying to interpret their work of like what exactly is the artist trying to do. Or I think I'm always been a fan of artists that help like make me question either the material, the story, or like the work itself. So that's something that I try to do with my work as well. So everything is now what it seems, essentially.
And one last question about your figures before we move on to the next part. So I'm sure people who are familiar with your work, or who are new to your work just from this conversation, know or have noticed that all of your figures have the same rainbow ears. So can you touch on those and kind of talk about that motif?
Yeah. I think even going back to like the person of children in my work, like before I thought I could become an artist, like my dream job was being like a children's book illustrator. So that was kind of like my dream job. Like in high school, I was like, okay, being an artist doesn't seem realistic, so let me be something that's creative. Of course, things ended up very different, but essentially, you know, how this style became what it is, just like with the work starting more as like children's book illustrations, and then they became what they are today. In that process, I definitely tried to like sharpen my work, make it a little bit more contemporary, make it a little bit like stronger, make it a little bit more deeper in different ways. And then one of the unique characteristics, other than the anatomy of the figures, is that they have these like rainbow ears. I think it was important for me to make sure that the figures were able to represent the Caribbean, no matter if the painting itself has a relationship to that. So as you walk through the show, you see all the figures have like these rainbow ears. And essentially they almost are like, when you open like a clamshell and they have all these like pearlescent colors on the inside, almost like a rainbow. And they almost feel like ears too when you like break the two shells apart. And I think also growing up in the islands too, in like Dominican Republic, in my case, you grow up with like, if you put a shell to your ear, you can hear the ocean. So shells have always had this like audible sense to them. So yeah, the colorful ears basically come from the pearlescence of the inside of the clam. And that's something that you will see throughout my figures. It essentially has become part of the anatomy of the figures, so you can distinguish them in different ways.
I love that. Thank you.
Another technical part that we should have touched upon in the beginning, for those of you that haven't seen the show yet, as you are looking at the screen, they may look like paintings, but they're not exactly paintings. They are mixed media collages. So you'll essentially, the figures are made on paper, and they are glued onto a wood panel. Most of the background, it is painted, but you also will see a lot of the use of wallpaper in the works too. In this case, you see like the three dresses are these like wallpaper, as well as the curtains in the background. But that's something that we can get deeper once you go up to the galleries and see the work in person. But just a heads up that I am mainly a mixed media artist and not so much a painter, even though of course there's paint in the figures.
And so I know, yeah, we spent a lot of time with our American art collection, but one of the other collections that we spent a ton of time with, which I'm very grateful to our Associate Curator of Arts of Global Africa, Hanon Girma. We spent a lot of time with our Arts of Global Africa collection because I know we were thinking a lot about, enslaved people brought from Africa to the Caribbean, and then, all the different cultures that now call the Caribbean home. We also spent some time with our Arts of Global Asia collection, but this was, aside from the American art collection, really the other major touch point. So something that people may know, or may not, can you talk more about your use of weapons? I'm sure people are like, why is she showing these daggers and a machete? So can you talk a little bit more about that and where that comes from?
Definitely. I think in my particular case, it varies from work to work, but in this particular exhibition that we talk about like a lot of like liberation and different like things here. Specifically in the Caribbean or like in the islands, with the Haitian Revolution, machetes were essentially the weapon of choice, or like the weapons that essentially freed most of the island from colonization. So I think I've always been very interested in sharp objects in general, but machetes, are closer to home, definitely. So I think looking through a lot of this collection and how historically these blades and knives have been used for different types of revolutions, I think was important to highlight back in the exhibition. So this one painting also includes an actual machete as part of the work itself. Kind of in a different context, but it's still within that kind of sense of liberation or wanting to be liberated or working towards that.
And for me, I feel like it's such an obvious and recognizable symbol of the Caribbean. It was used in sugarcane fields. My dad had one in the house growing up. It was not a weapon, it was just, we just had it. But it was just something that a lot of my friends, we had machetes in the house, and that was just a very normal thing. And yeah, so to me,
not in the U.S.
Well, in New Jersey we did have one.
I mean, they're in my studio, but
so
not as weapons though.
So yeah, to me, and seeing that connection, seeing that, yeah, of course, not of course, I hadn't really thought about it before until we really started working on this exhibition. Yes, these tools do come from Africa. And I think that a lot of this body of work and a lot of your work in general really kind of really looks to or aims to kind of uncover these hidden narratives or these hidden parts of Caribbean history or these parts of Caribbean history that have kind of been absorbed or forgotten. And I think a lot of your work really kind of pays homage to these African histories that are often forgotten.
You know, me as an artist coming into the quote unquote art world, I think it kind of opened my eyes into how little people know about the Caribbean in general. I think even to this day, there are not even a lot of like Caribbean artist exhibitions or like spaces that kind of prioritize. So I did have to like get used to having to explain a lot of times about like my culture and like where we come from and how we got to the point that we are today. So there has been a lot of like sometimes it's hard to explain the same thing over and over, but I do have to realize that specifically for Caribbean art and a lot of times Latin American art, there's not a lot of space so far in contemporary art. So I think that's why it's important to, in my particular case, like, you know, every artist has like their way of doing things, but I do take the responsibility of like trying to inform people about the history of where I came from so people understand where it's actually coming from. Like not only the works, but also what I'm trying to say with the work and why it's important as well.
And I think that's really interesting that you say that because I think some of the feedback I've gotten from people who are from or have ties to the Caribbean, they get it immediately. Like, and I think people are very relieved is not the word, but people feel like, oh, okay, like somebody gets it, somebody knows, like somebody is seeing all these different intricacies and nuances of the history of where I or my family is from. And I think
because this is the other layer. I think even like now being in America, a lot of people that have like Caribbean ancestry may not know as much as like from their histories, but they do get a lot of the symbolisms. They do get a lot of like the different motifs that are in the work because that's the thing that they grew up with, but just haven't made that connection right away. But it also, you know, at times, you know, we can get in a bubble of like our own people, and then when I go outside, it's like, oh, what do you mean you don't know how coconuts grow? You know, so which is an actual comment that I got one time. Because I did this like solo show in 2021 where I had like an actual coconut in the middle of the gallery, but it was sprouting. And they're like, oh, how come this coconut is doing this? I'm like, yeah, this is how coconuts should grow. And at that point, you know, it kind of like made me angry that I had to explain that, but I had to understand like it's different, it's new to this kind of like other group of people that may not know as much as that. This is like an example, but you know.
So one of the other areas of the collection that made its way, it's kind of like an Easter egg, it made its way into your artwork in kind of subtle ways that's probably not readily apparent, is hard edge abstraction. So I know that the Carmen Herrera piece, which is on view on the second floor, and I hope that everybody will have a chance to walk around the galleries and see all of these artworks that we're referencing in person, because, yeah, the museum is open till 9. So this Carmen Herrera painting, which is just down the hall, just around the corner from your artwork, from your exhibition, I remember when going to your studio when we were still working on the exhibition, you know, and you were finishing some of your paintings, and you had just finished Caribe Express, and you were like, oh, can you tell where Carmen is in this painting? And I was like, no. But once you explained it, and I'll let you explain it, and I'll let you talk about how she's kind of influenced your work in different ways. But yeah, once you explained it, I was like, I can't unsee it.
I think that's where like the research and working with a curator came into play too, because I always was gravitated to these kind of particular like geometric abstraction works. I just didn't know that was a term until like you brought it up. I was like, okay, that's what it is. But no, I think, you know, Carmen Herrera has always been like one of my like heroes in my work. I think as also as a fellow like Caribbean artist like that just got her due recently. She passed away like 2 years ago. So it was like really special when I saw the work in the collection. I think it was important to also like include her legacy as well in some kind of way. Again, going back to the idea of like things are not what they seem, or like things are not as literal. With me, I think I usually avoid straight lines in my work. That's something that I kind of like try to push myself with this particular exhibition. Like there's a lot of like geometric lines. This in this piece you'll see another section. I made this like a resort hotel that's very geometric. But I never like straight lines in general. I don't use a ruler until I made this work. And I think that got me thinking about like different ways that I could have incorporated her as inspiration. And here you see almost like the curve of the floor, how it almost interacts with like the curve in her painting as well, which is on view on the same floor. Do we have to? Okay. But no, yeah, you can see how the panel just cuts into two and almost goes into this more like geometric, but it has like a more a bit more curvature with like the pools on the other side of the work. So this is one of the works that I also like directly reference for this exhibition. That was really special to also include there. Definitely one of my favorite Carmen Herrera's work too. And again, you know, I think as an artist that, you know, has gotten her due more, but it should have been earlier, because she was making these kind of works where a lot of like the bigger artists were also doing the same thing. She was not noticed because she was a woman and because she was not from the U.S.
And so I know you mentioned Carmen is one of your heroes, and I know people might know or might not that Melvin Edwards, or Mel Edwards, an African American artist from the U.S., obviously African American, is also one of your heroes. And I think when people go into the space, they'll be able to kind of pick up on some of those moments of inspiration. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why you are drawn to Mel's work.
Yeah, so I think part of like the global contemporary, the experience of being able to put other people's work also as part of the exhibition and create that dialogue, I think, you know, I really took advantage of that in terms of like being in conversation with my heroes, essentially, with the artists that I have completely admired. I haven't met Melvin, of course, but you know, his works, specifically like the chains and the materiality and the history that goes in his work, and the craftsmanship also has something that have definitely helped me push my work, especially with the inclusion of chains. I think a lot of the his welding and the chains inclusion and the history that they have pertaining to his work is, you know, was something that I resonated with in terms of like telling these like stories that are difficult to tell, but they are more like in an abstract way that you can still sense the materiality of the chain itself through the work itself. And that's something that you'll see throughout the show as well. In this case, with the sculpture that has like all these metal chains and have that conversation there too. I'm just leaving some space so there's questions when we go up.
No, I was gonna
Between not over-explaining everything, but you know, we can talk for hours.
No, and yeah. Well, and I was just gonna say for folks who don't know that the two Mel Edwards works that are included in the exhibition are from his Lynch Fragment series. So there are these really powerful and disturbing artworks where he welds together materials that were used in lynchings of Black Americans, and in doing so, sometimes he also is thinking about and referencing African masks, and I don't know if this is over-explaining for you, but I know we put these two artworks in conversation with your resort scene, both with kind of the Diablo masks that your figures are wearing, you know, this persistence of African masking traditions across the Caribbean, but also thinking about like the undercurrent of violence that is part of the Caribbean's history and part of the Caribbean's present. And I know we can talk more about that when we get up to the space if you want, but you know, just that was really kind of those were really some of the things that we were thinking about when pairing these artworks, in addition to the materiality and the, yeah. So with that, I'm looking at the time, because yeah, as you said, we could we could be here forever. I am going to invite everybody up to the second floor. There is an elevator if anybody would like to use the elevator. There's also stairs. And if you're not able to join us for the talk in the exhibition space, I hope that you'll take a look around the galleries and see some of the artwork that Bonnie was inspired by for Cattleya. So hopefully see you upstairs.
Thank you. Thank you.